They wanted him on his knees. Not for prayer, not for ceremony, not for any reason that made sense, just power, pure and simple. But Royal Guard had buried too many friends to kneel for the wrong reasons. So when the king's advisor tried to make an example out of him, turning a decorated soldier into a public test of obedience, it wasn't the guard who broke protocol, it was the little prince standing on the platform. And what he said, stepping down alone between power and principle, didn't just silence the courtyard, it changed everything. But before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, you've never seen anything like what this boy did, make sure you hit that subscribe button with notifications on. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Because this wasn't about protocol, this wasn't about tradition, this was about a child who understood honor better than the adults around him. And what he did next will restore your faith in the future of the monarchy. Windsor Castle wore autumn like old velvet, rich and worn at the edges. Late afternoon light caught the stone just right, turning everything golden. The flags stirring in the breeze, the brass fittings on the ceremonial barriers, even the faces of tourists pressed 3 deep against the ropes. Cameras clicked in that familiar rhythm of royal events. Some professional rigs from the media pen, others just phones held high above heads. Near the West Gate, an American girl waved a souvenir Union Jack while her mother whispered, "That's him. That's the king." But 30 paces from the royal platform, every lens was actually focused on someone else entirely. The man in scarlet who stood like he'd been carved from the stone itself. Sergeant Alaric Drummond held his position with the kind of stillness that comes from places where moving at the wrong moment meant not going home. 6'3" in his ceremonial boots, shoulders squared, rifle cradled with parade ground precision. His bare skin cast shadows across a face marked by one pale scar that curved beneath his right brow. Souvenir from a firefight outside Sangjin that took half his unit and left him with a limp he'd learned to hide. The tourists saw pageantry. The press saw photo opportunities. Drummond saw everything else. 2 aides whispering behind the inner rope line, both overdressed for a sunset ceremony. A royal photographer adjusting his lens toward the guard formation instead of the platform. A thin man with a leather folder pacing near the dais. Someone Drummond didn't recognize, which made him worth watching. In Helmond, staying alive meant counting details others missed. Here in Windsor, the battlefield was different, but the alertness remained. 1 breath every 8 seconds, eyes forward, mind cataloguing every inconsistency. And right now, something felt wrong. It started as a murmur from the platform behind him, not loud enough for the crowd to hear, but Drummond's ears had been trained to catch the conversations that mattered. "Your Majesty, see how he stares," as if above command. The voice was smooth, cultured, dismissive, the kind that issued orders from air-conditioned offices while other men bled in sand. Drummond had heard that tone before, usually right before someone made a decision that got soldiers killed. He didn't turn, couldn't, even if he wanted to. But his shoulders tightened just slightly as he recognized what was coming. Someone was about to make him a problem. Lord Peregrine Harrow had perfected the art of being indispensable. 3 monarchs, countless ceremonies, always positioned just close enough to whisper in the right ear at the right moment. He was the kind of advisor who never raised his voice because he never had to. Power whispered was often more effective than power shouted. Right now, he leaned toward King Charles with practiced intimacy. "Look at him, Majesty." Rigid as a monument, when protocol becomes pride, it stops serving the crown. His tone carried just the right note of concern. He's the same guard from the Nigerian visit. Wouldn't step aside for their security detail, caused a whole diplomatic delay. King Charles kept his eyes on the program in his lap. He followed regulations. Of course, but sometimes, Harrow paused, choosing his words like a surgeon selecting instruments. Sometimes loyalty needs to be demonstrated, not just assumed. The press have been questioning whether our ceremonial guards are mere decoration or genuine servants of the crown. The king's brow furrowed slightly. Harrow pressed on. A simple gesture would end all speculation. Have him show proper deference, just once. It would photograph beautifully, tradition and humility combined. Very reassuring to our critics. Charles said nothing, but he didn't object either. That silence was all Harrow needed. He descended the platform steps with the confidence of a man who'd already won the argument, clipboard tucked under his arm like royal mandate. Two younger aides trailed behind, their steps uncertain. The crowd parted without thinking. So did a security officer. So did one of the press photographers, who sensed something newsworthy approaching. Harrow stopped directly in front of Sergeant Drummond. The guard didn't acknowledge him. Protocol forbade it. "Sergeant," Harrow's voice carried just far enough to reach nearby microphones. "What a picture you make." Stalwart, dependable. He tilted his head, studying Drummond like an art critic examining a painting. "But loyalty isn't posture, is it? Real loyalty is action. Demonstration." Still no response from the guard. Harrow stepped closer, his voice dropping to that intimate register politicians used when they wanted to sound reasonable. "Let's give them something meaningful to photograph, shall we?" He raised his right hand in a slow, theatrical gesture designed for maximum camera appeal. "Kneel," he said, clear and deliberate, "before your sovereign." The silence that followed felt like a held breath, because royal guards don't kneel. Not for visiting dignitaries, not for ceremony, not for anyone. It would be like asking Big Ben to bow. It violated the fundamental nature of what they represented. But Harrow was smiling now, the kind of expression that said he knew exactly what he was asking. And why? Sergeant Drummond felt the weight of every eye in the forecourt settling on his shoulders. Behind him, King Charles sat silent. Around him, cameras turned like flowers following sun. The crowd sensed drama without understanding its source. This wasn't about ceremony anymore. In his mind, Drummond was back in Afghanistan, the checkpoint outside Sangin, heat thick as syrup. A local boy with an empty satchel, ordered to drop to one knee by a man who shouldn't have been giving orders. 3 soldiers complied with the demand. Drummond hadn't. The IED blast took 2 of them. The third never woke up. He'd learned the hard way that some orders weren't meant to be followed, no matter who gave them. And some positions weren't meant to be abandoned, no matter the pressure. "Protocol forbids it, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard. Harrow's smile sharpened. "Don't hide behind regulations, Sergeant. Your king watches. The world watches. A little humility won't break your spine." "Ceremonial regulations prohibit deviation without direct order from my commanding officer," Drummond replied, tone unchanged. "That order has not been given. I speak with full authority of the royal household." "Then a written directive would suffice, sir." The game was becoming clear to everyone watching. This wasn't about respect or tradition. It was about dominance, about whether institutional pressure could bend an individual will. Harrow's voice rose just enough for the press to catch every word. "Then I'll ask you plainly, before everyone here, kneel before your betters." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes began strobing. This was the moment editors would lead with, the image that would define the story. On the platform, King Charles shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. That silence was being interpreted as consent. Drummond inhaled steadily. When he spoke, his voice was quiet as steel. "My oath is to stand. Always." And he did, even as the pressure mounted, even as the world watched, even as the game turned darker with every passing second. He held his ground because some things, dignity, duty, the memory of friends who had died for real principles, weren't negotiable. 30 feet away, Prince George sat straighter than most adults. At 11, he'd already mastered the art of royal composure, spine erect, hands folded precisely, face arranged in that careful neutrality they taught you before you could properly tie your shoes. It was survival technique for hours of pageantry, the way you learned to carry the weight of constant scrutiny. But composure didn't stop his eyes from moving, and right now they were locked on the confrontation unfolding below. He knew that guard, not his name or his story, but his face. Drummond was one of the constants, always at his post during state visits, never smiling during ceremonies, never looking anywhere except where duty demanded. He held his position like the entire monarchy depended on his vigilance. George had always admired that kind of steadiness, which made it worse to watch Lord Harrow circle him like a predator. The boy couldn't hear every word, but tone told the story. Harrow's head tilted with practiced condescension. The crowd's energy shifted from ceremony to spectacle. Photographers swung their lenses away from the royal platform toward the drama below. George glanced at his grandfather. King Charles remained motionless, expression unreadable, one hand resting on his chair arm. His face revealed nothing, as always. But Harrow's voice was rising now, carrying clearly across the forecourt. "Before your betters!" George's stomach clenched. He watched Drummond, still perfectly postured, unmoving. The guard's silence spoke louder than any protest could. This wasn't defiance. It was dignity under assault. When Harrow leaned close enough for his lips to be readable, George caught the final demand, "One knee or be gone." The boy's heart hammered. Every lesson he'd learned about protocol, about staying silent during ceremonies, about being seen but not heard, battled against something deeper. This wasn't about breaking rules. This was about watching someone be bullied for doing exactly what he was supposed to do. George looked toward his father. Prince William was deep in conversation with a diplomatic guest. Then, back at his grandfather, who still hadn't moved. In that moment, something crystallized in the boy's chest. Not fear, responsibility. Every eye in the forecourt was watching, but no one was standing beside the man being humiliated for standing still. His knuckles went white against the armrest. Through years of history lessons, he remembered one phrase cutting through all the others. "Royalty exists to protect those who protect us." The brass band was winding down. The crowd grew restless. Harrow's voice climbed higher, and Sergeant Drummond still hadn't moved an inch. George's breath caught, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He watched, every muscle coiled, waiting for the moment when silence would become complicity. Lord Harrow stepped back, boots clicking against stone. The crowd had gone quiet. Not the respectful hush of ceremony, but the electric stillness before lightning strikes. Everyone sensed the shift from pageantry to confrontation. Drummond's stillness had become its own form of resistance. And Harrow didn't like being ignored, especially with cameras rolling. He turned to the two aides hovering behind him. "Remove him." The words weren't shouted, but they cut through the air like a verdict. One aide hesitated. "Sir, we—" Harrow silenced him with a look. "The king hasn't objected," he said, loud enough to be heard. "This is about discipline. We won't let disobedience fester." On the platform, King Charles shifted, lips parting as if to speak. But Harrow was already leaning close, whispering urgently, "Strength, Majesty. Let it happen." The king's mouth closed. The aides moved forward reluctantly. Drummond's rifle never wavered. His posture never changed. But his voice, when it came, was steel wrapped in velvet. "Touch me and you violate ceremonial protocol, the king's own regulations, not mine." That stopped them, just for a heartbeat. But Harrow was already smiling. He had the drama he wanted, the optics of authority, challenged and answered. And that's when everything changed. One movement from the platform. Prince George stood. Every camera in the forecourt turned at once. The gasps were audible, sharp intakes from reporters, from tourists, from palace staff trained never to react. The boy wasn't running or shouting. He simply rose with the perfect posture they'd drilled into him since childhood. For a split second it looked like part of the choreography. But it wasn't. It was revolution, quiet as breathing. In powder blue jacket and polished shoes, the 11-year-old prince took his first step down the platform stairs. His eyes were fixed ahead, spine straight as the guards he'd always admired. Prince William noticed first, brow furrowing, but he didn't stop him. King Charles turned slowly, taking in his grandson, then Harrow, then the guard, who hadn't budged. The aides froze mid-approach. Harrow blinked, his confidence flickering for the first time. The crowd fell silent. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, music forgotten. Because in the middle of all the gold braid and ancient protocol, a child had chosen his side, and he was walking straight toward it. The sound of Prince George's shoes on stone was soft, but it echoed like thunder. Each step seemed to slow time itself. Aides held their breath. Shutters snapped in rhythm. Every gaze swung from Harrow to the boy crossing the forecourt. He didn't hurry, didn't gesture or call out. He simply walked the way his tutors had taught him to enter a room, carrying the weight of his name with quiet dignity. By the time George reached the base of the platform, even the tourists had stopped recording. Phones lowered, children stared. Reporters forgot their prepared questions. He crossed the full length of the ceremonial space, the only sound his polished soles striking flagstone worn smooth by 8 centuries of history, until he stopped beside Sergeant Drummond. The guard never turned. Protocol wouldn't allow it. George didn't expect him to. Instead, the boy stepped forward, placing himself half a pace in front of Drummond's shoulder. His small frame was dwarfed by the scarlet-clad soldier, but his presence filled the space around them. Lord Harrow's face had gone pale. He blinked twice, then recovered enough to sneer. "Your Highness, this is not your concern." George lifted his chin. "It is when someone who stands for us is being humiliated for doing exactly that." The words carried across the courtyard, clear as church bells. Somewhere in the press section, a BBC microphone caught every syllable. Harrow glanced desperately toward King Charles, but the monarch remained motionless. George took a breath, then spoke again, his voice pitched to carry. "He will not kneel." He turned slightly toward the assembled cameras, not posing, not performing, but ensuring he was heard. "He stands for Britain." "And so do I." No tremor in his voice, no hesitation, just conviction, pure and unshakable. Drummond didn't speak, didn't nod, but something behind his expression shifted. The slightest tightening of jaw, the almost imperceptible straightening of already perfect posture. Recognition passed between them, without words. Harrow's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The aides didn't move. In that impossible silence, the entire forecourt seemed to exhale at once. The child had drawn his line in the sand, not in private chambers or future policy meetings, but here, now, in front of the crown and cameras and the watching world. Without raising his voice, without force, with nothing but moral clarity, George had shattered the moment. The boy who was never supposed to speak had become the loudest voice in the square. Lord Harrow retreated a single step. Not defeat, not yet, but the first crack in his composure. "Your Majesty," he called, trying to summon royal support, "the boy misunderstands." This was symbolic, a unifying gesture. King Charles looked at him with something that might have been weariness, not anger, not coldness, just exhaustion with games played in shadows. The king still hadn't spoken. Harrow tried again, turning toward the cameras. The guard refused a direct request made in respect. "We must maintain ceremonial discipline." "He didn't refuse out of pride," George interrupted, his voice cutting cleanly through Harrow's explanation. The advisor froze. "He refused," the boy continued, "because some things aren't meant to be performed." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Even those who didn't grasp every nuance understood the shift. This was no longer advisor versus soldier. It was power confronting principle. King Charles finally rose from his seat. He stepped forward, not dramatically, not hurriedly, just far enough to be seen by all. His gaze moved from Harrow to George, then to Drummond, then back to his senior advisor. No script existed for this moment. For a long beat, it seemed the king might remain silent again, but then his voice cut across the forecourt, quiet but unmistakable. "That's enough, Lord Harrow!" The words dropped like a final judgment. Harrow blinked as if waiting for clarification. "Majesty!" "Enough!" Charles repeated, firmer now. "This is neither the place for your instruction, nor the man for your experiments." The advisor's face seemed to collapse inward, not theatrically, but subtly, like fabric losing its shape. His spine appeared to shrink under the weight of royal disapproval. George stepped forward again, turning toward his grandfather. "He stands," he said simply. And King Charles, to the surprise of even his security detail, repeated the words aloud. "He stands." Nothing more was needed. The two aides stepped back immediately, hands clasped behind them. Harrow couldn't argue further. The command had come from the only voice that mattered, and this time it was crystal clear. For the first time in his career, Lord Peregrine Harrow had misread the room entirely and paid for it in front of the world. He turned without ceremony and walked quickly toward the platform stairs, clipboard clutched like armour. The crowd didn't jeer or cheer. They simply watched him go, the man who'd tried to make a soldier bow and ended up bowed himself. George turned back to Drummond, offering one last nod. Subtle, barely visible, but unmistakable. Drummond couldn't return it. Protocol wouldn't allow such acknowledgement. But in that shared silence, understanding passed between them completely. A prince had spoken. A king had answered. And a soldier still stood exactly where duty demanded. There was no fanfare, no announcement, no dramatic lighting change. The brass band simply began to play again. The first notes were tentative, as if the musicians weren't sure the ceremony still existed. Then the rhythm found its footing, and the march resumed. Drums fell into line. Horns lifted their voices. Pageantry remembered how to breathe. But everything had changed. Prince George stood a moment longer, then turned toward the platform. His shoulders were square, his pace measured. Something in his bearing had shifted, not arrogance, not defiance, just the quiet weight of someone who'd discovered what standing up actually meant. No longer just a boy in formal wear, now a witness, a participant, a protector. Prince William met him at the base of the stairs. No embrace. They were still in public, still under 1,000 watching lenses, but he placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Back to your seat," he said quietly. But his tone carried approval. George didn't respond, but his eyes found Drummond one final time. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't shifted, hadn't acknowledged what had happened. But something in the way afternoon light caught his profile, suggested the weight on his shoulders had changed. For the first time in hours, he wasn't holding his position alone. King Charles resumed his seat, visibly shaken but composed. He didn't glance at Harrow's vacant chair. The absence spoke louder than presence ever could. Along the crowd barriers, whispers began. "They'll write about this, won't they? Did you see what that boy did? I thought guards couldn't move." The reporters already knew. Notebooks flicked open. Cameras adjusted. This wasn't scandal or security breach. It was something rarer. A moment of monarchy shaped not by handlers or protocol officers, but by conscience acting in real time. The ceremony rolled forward. Salutes, music, the ancient choreography of British pageantry. But Sergeant Drummond remained exactly where he'd always stood, and everything around him had been quietly transformed. He'd been tested, not by enemy fire or protesters, but by his own institution, by the machinery of power that usually ground individuals into compliance. And he'd held his ground, not from pride or stubbornness, but because some things, dignity, duty, the memory of friends who died for principles that mattered, weren't subject to negotiation. Now, because a boy had recognised that in him, all of Windsor Castle had witnessed what happened when quiet courage met institutional overreach. The tourist cameras kept clicking. The ceremony proceeded. History moved forward by inches, measured not in crowns or bloodlines, but in who chose to stand when standing mattered, and who refused to let them stand alone. What would you have done if you'd been in that forecourt? Should King Charles have intervened sooner, or was it right to let the moment unfold naturally? When a soldier follows his oath against unjust pressure, is that insubordination, or is that the truest definition of loyalty? Let us know in the comments. We read every single response. If this story reminded you why quiet courage still matters, tap that like button. Hit subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss moments like this. And share this with someone who thinks ceremony is just for show. Another story of loyalty tested and honour defended is waiting right here. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow for more proof that the most important battles are often the quietest ones.